In the scorching summer of 1883, a dying child changed everything. When struggling rancher Jonah Reed discovered a broken wagon in the Colorado wasteland, he faced an impossible choice: turn away a desperate mother and her 5 starving children, or risk losing the little he had left. What happened next would test every ounce of his strength, challenge his hardened heart, and transform barren dust into something worth fighting for. This is a story of survival, sacrifice, and the unexpected family forged under the merciless western sun. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. The sun beat down on the Colorado territory like a hammer against an anvil, relentless and unforgiving. It was the kind of heat that made a man question every decision that had brought him to this godforsaken stretch of earth. Jonah Reed pulled his hat lower over his eyes, squinting against the glare that turned the landscape into a shimmering mirage. The year was 1883, and the summer had arrived early and mean, sucking the moisture from everything it touched. Jonah's horse, a sturdy bay mare named Copper, picked her way carefully along the fence line. The wood posts stood like skeletal sentries, marking the boundaries of what Jonah still called his ranch, though the term felt more like wishful thinking with each passing day. The grass had turned brittle and yellow, crunching under Copper's hooves. Water was scarce, feed was scarcer, and Jonah's patience with the land, with life itself, had worn thin as parchment. He was 32 years old and felt 60. The lines around his eyes had deepened from squinting into too many sunrises, and his hands bore the calluses and scars of a man who'd worked every day of his life since he could walk. His father had staked this claim 15 years ago, full of dreams about cattle and prosperity. Those dreams had died with him 3 winters back, leaving Jonah alone with 200 acres of stubborn earth and memories that offered no comfort. The fence needed mending in a dozen places. Jonah dismounted, pulled wire and pliers from his saddlebag, and set to work on a sagging section. Sweat dripped from his nose as he twisted the wire tight, his muscles remembering the motion from 1,000 repetitions. The work was endless. Every time he fixed one thing, 2 more broke. It was like trying to hold back the desert with his bare hands. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals in lazy spirals. Jonah watched it for a moment, envying its freedom. That bird could leave any time it wanted, could fly to where the grass still grew green and the water ran cool. But Jonah was tied to this land by chains he couldn't name. Duty, stubbornness, maybe just the lack of anywhere else to go. He finished the repair and wiped his forehead with his sleeve, leaving a streak of dirt across his sunburned skin. Copper stamped her feet, anxious to move on. Jonah was about to remount when he noticed something odd in the distance, near the ravine that cut through the eastern section of his property. At first he thought it was another trick of the heat, a dark shape that wavered and dissolved in the rising air. But as he stared, it remained solid. Something was down there, where nothing should be. The ravine was bone dry this time of year, just cracked earth and scattered rocks. Nobody traveled that way. There was no reason to. Curiosity pulled at him, though he tried to ignore it. He had work to do, and the day was already half gone. But the shape didn't move, and something about its stillness bothered him. With a sigh that came from somewhere deep in his chest, Jonah swung back into the saddle and turned Copper toward the ravine. The ride took 10 minutes, and with each passing moment, the shape resolved into something more distinct. It was a wagon, or what was left of one. The canvas top was torn and sun-bleached, flapping weakly in the hot wind. One wheel was completely shattered, splintered wood scattered across the hardpan. The wagon listed to one side like a ship taking on water. Jonah's hand moved instinctively to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Trouble came in many forms out here: bandits, rustlers, men running from the law. He approached slowly, every sense alert. Copper's ears swiveled forward, picking up sounds Jonah's duller human hearing couldn't catch. As he drew closer, he heard it, a soft whimpering like an injured animal. But it wasn't an animal. It was a child. Jonah's chest tightened. He urged Copper forward and came around to the back of the wagon. What he saw made him pull up short. A woman sat in the wagon's shade, her back against the wooden side. She held a small child in her arms. A boy, maybe 4 years old. His face flushed red despite being out of the direct sun. Around her, 4 other children huddled together, their eyes huge and thin faces. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12. They all stared at Jonah with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. The woman looked up at him. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 28 or 30, but hardship had carved its story into her features. Her dark hair hung in tangles around her face, and her lips were cracked and bleeding from the sun. Her dress, once probably a decent calico, was stained with dust and sweat. "Please," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper, rough as sandpaper. "Water." Jonah sat frozen in his saddle. This was trouble. He knew it in his bones. These people weren't his problem. He had nothing to spare. Not water, not food, not time. The smart thing would be to ride to town, tell the sheriff, let someone else handle it. These were strangers, and the territory wasn't kind to men who took in every lost soul they stumbled across. But the child in her arms made a small, keening sound, and Jonah saw that the boy's eyes were glazed, unfocused. The kid was in bad shape. They all were. How long had they been out here? He dismounted slowly, approaching with caution. The woman didn't move, didn't even seem to have the strength for it. The other children pressed closer to her, protective and terrified at once. "How long you been here?" Jonah asked. 2 days. Her voice cracked on the words. "Maybe 3. The wheel broke. My husband, he went for help." Jonah glanced around at the empty landscape. No tracks leading away except the wagon's own trail. No sign of anyone coming back. "When did he leave?" The woman's eyes dropped. 3 days ago, maybe 4. He wasn't coming back. Jonah could see that she knew it too, could see it in the way she held her children tighter, as if she could shield them from that terrible truth. Jonah crouched down, staying a respectful distance away. He pulled his canteen from his belt and held it out. The woman reached for it with shaking hands, uncapped it, and held it to the small boy's lips. The child managed only a few sips before turning his head away weakly. "Give it to the others first," Jonah said quietly. "Small sips. Not too much at once." She nodded and passed the canteen to the next youngest, a girl of maybe 6 with tangled blonde hair. The children drank in turn, each taking only what they needed before passing it on. Even in their desperation, they'd been taught to share. That told Jonah something about their mother. When the oldest child, a boy with serious dark eyes, handed the canteen back, there was still water in it. Jonah gestured for the woman to drink. She hesitated, then tipped the canteen to her lips. He watched her throat work as she swallowed, saw the way her eyes closed in relief. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mara. Mara Hale." She looked at her children. "This is Thomas, Sarah, Emma, Luke, and—" She touched the small boy's fevered forehead. "And this is Daniel." "Jonah Reed. I've got a ranch about 2 miles west of here." He stood, studying the broken wagon. The axle was cracked clean through. It wasn't getting fixed out here, and even if it could be, these people were in no shape to travel. The smart thing, the safe thing. Right away. But the heat shimmered off the cracked earth, and Jonah thought about what another day out here would do to these children. He thought about the small boy's glazed eyes, about how a person could die of thirst in this country before anyone even knew they were lost. He thought about his father, who'd always said that a man was measured not by what he kept, but by what he was willing to share when sharing hurt. Damn. "Can you ride?" he asked Mara. She nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed her. "Then here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take you and the children to my ranch. There's shade there and water and a place to rest. We'll figure out the rest later." Relief flooded Mara's face, so intense it was almost painful to see. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much. We'll work. We won't be a burden. I promise we'll—" "Save your strength," Jonah interrupted. He wasn't interested in promises. Promises were just words, and words were cheap. "Can you walk?" "Yes." She struggled to stand, still holding Daniel. The other children scrambled up with her, clinging to her skirts. Jonah whistled for Copper, who'd wandered a few feet away to nose at a patch of scrub. He helped Mara onto the horse's back, then handed Daniel up to her. The boy was light as kindling, burning up with fever. "The rest of you will have to walk," Jonah said to the other children. "It's not far. Can you do that?" Thomas, the oldest boy, straightened his shoulders. "Yes, sir." They started west, Jonah leading Copper by the reins, The children trudged behind in a ragged line, too tired for talk. The sun continued its merciless arc across the sky, and Jonah watched their shadows shorten and shift. Each step kicked up small clouds of dust that settled on their already filthy clothes. Sarah, the 6-year-old, stumbled. Emma, who looked about 8, caught her sister's hand and helped her up without a word. They kept moving. Jonah found himself stealing glances at them. 5 children, 5 mouths to feed, 5 bodies that would need shelter and care. What had he gotten himself into? His supplies were already stretched thin. The ranch barely supported 1 person, let alone 7. But when he looked at Daniel's flushed face, at Mara's determined grip on her son, he knew he couldn't have made a different choice. Not, and lived with himself afterward. The ranch buildings appeared in the distance. A weathered house, a barn that leaned slightly to the north, a few outbuildings in various states of disrepair. It wasn't much, but it was home. Or as close to home as Jonah had anymore. As they approached, Mara lifted her head and looked around. If she was disappointed by what she saw, she didn't show it. She just held her son closer and kept her eyes forward. Jonah led them past the main house to an old supply shed behind the barn. It was sturdier than it looked, with thick walls that kept out the worst of the heat and a roof that didn't leak. He used it for storage mostly, but it was cleaner than the barn and had a small stove in one corner. "You can stay here," he said, pushing open the door. The inside was dim and blessedly cooler than the open air. "It's not much, but it's out of the sun." Mara slid down from Copper's back with Daniel in her arms. She stepped into the shed and looked around, and Jonah saw her shoulders sag with relief. There were old blankets stacked on a shelf, a few crates that could serve as seats, even a cracked mirror hanging on one wall. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thank you." The other children filed in, their eyes adjusting to the dimness. Thomas immediately began organizing a space for them to sit, moving crates with quiet efficiency. The girls helped, falling into practiced roles. Jonah cleared his throat. "I'll bring water and food, what I've got. The well's just there." He pointed through the door to a stone well about 30 yards away. "The water's good, cold." "We can get it ourselves," Mara said quickly. "You've done enough. We can—" "Later," Jonah cut her off. "Rest first. I'll be back." He left before she could argue, leading Copper toward the barn. His mind was already running through his supplies. He had cornmeal, some dried beans, a little salt pork. Not much, but enough to make a decent meal. There were eggs if the hens were laying, which they usually were. Milk from the cow. In the barn, he unsaddled Copper and brushed her down, his hands moving through the familiar routine while his thoughts churned. What was he supposed to do with these people? He couldn't just keep them here indefinitely. But he couldn't send them back out into the wilderness either, not in their condition. The child, Daniel, needed medicine, needed a doctor. The nearest town was 15 miles south, a hard ride in good weather. In this heat, it would be brutal. Jonah finished with Copper and headed to the well. He drew up bucket after bucket of cold, clear water, filling every container he could find. His muscles burned with the effort, but it felt good to have a concrete task, something to do with his hands while his mind wrestled with bigger problems. He carried water to the shed first. When he entered, he found Mara had laid Daniel on a blanket in the coolest corner. The other children sat quietly nearby, watching their little brother with worried eyes. Thomas had found a rag somewhere and was wiping the dust from the girls' faces. Jonah set the buckets down. "Drink what you need. I'll bring more." On his next trip, he brought food. A pot of cornmeal mush he'd cooked quickly on his own stove, thick and filling. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot, and there was enough of it. He'd added some of his precious salt and a little of the bacon fat he'd been saving. The children ate like they'd been starving, which he supposed they had been. Even Daniel managed a few bites before falling back into restless sleep. Mara tried to make it last, tried to eat slowly, but Jonah could see the hunger in her eyes. "There's more," he told her. "Eat." She did, and when the pot was empty, she looked at him with such gratitude that Jonah had to turn away. He wasn't used to being looked at like that, wasn't sure he deserved it. "The boy needs medicine," he said roughly. "Fever like that. It's not good." "I know." Mara's hand rested on Daniel's forehead. "But we have no money, nothing to trade. I'll ride to town tomorrow, talk to the doctor." "We can't pay." I'll figure it out. Jonah moved toward the door. You all get some rest. I'll check on you later. He escaped before she could protest further, stepping back into the heat. The sun was starting its descent now, the light turning golden. In a few hours, it would be cooler. Not cool, but better than the midday inferno. Jonah stood for a moment, looking at his ranch with fresh eyes. The house needed painting. The barn needed shoring up. The fences needed constant repair. The land needed rain that wouldn't come. And now he had 6 more people depending on him. He should have ridden past that wagon. Should have let someone else find them. But even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't true. There had been no choice. Not really. Not for him. The evening chores called. Animals to feed, the cow to milk, eggs to collect. Jonah threw himself into the work, grateful for the distraction. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, he found himself thinking about his father again. Sometimes a man's got to do what's right, not what's easy, the old man used to say. Yeah, Pa, Jonah muttered to the empty air. But you never said what to do when right and impossible are the same damn thing. The sky didn't answer. It just kept burning, beautiful and indifferent, as the day bled into night. Inside the shed, Mara held Daniel close and listened to the sounds of her other children finally breathing easy in sleep. They'd been so brave, so strong. Thomas had kept the girls going when she'd been ready to give up. Sarah and Emma had shared everything without complaint. And Luke, only 7, had walked those 2 miles without a single whimper. She looked around the shed in the fading light. It was just a storage building, rough and spare, but it had walls and a roof. It had shade and water nearby. After days in the open, burning under that terrible sun, it felt like a palace. And the man, Jonah Reed. Mara didn't know what to make of him. He was gruff, almost harsh in his manner, but his actions spoke differently. He'd shared his food when she could see he had little. He'd given them shelter when he clearly lived alone and probably preferred it that way. He'd promised to ride for medicine for a child who wasn't his. Mara had learned long ago that a person's words meant less than their deeds. And Jonah Reed's deeds, so far, had been those of a good man. Daniel stirred in her arms, whimpering softly. She touched his forehead and felt the heat still radiating from his small body. Fear clenched her heart. She'd already lost so much. Her husband had abandoned them. She knew that now. Had known it the moment he rode away and didn't return. He'd always been a dreamer, chasing schemes that never panned out, dragging his family from place to place with promises of fortune that never materialized. But she couldn't lose Daniel, couldn't lose any of her children. They were all she had left. Please, she whispered into the darkness, not sure who she was asking. Please, let him be okay. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance. The sound was lonely and wild, a voice of the desert night. But inside the shed, her children slept safely, and that was enough. For now, it was enough. Jonah sat on his porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. Copper was settled in the barn, the chickens were in their coop, and the cow was in her pen. Everything was as it should be, except now there were 6 people in his supply shed, depending on him to keep them alive. He thought about the ride to town tomorrow. The medicine would cost money he didn't have. The doctor might extend credit, or he might not. Jonah's reputation was solid enough, but solid reputations didn't pay bills. He'd have to sell something, maybe one of the heifers he'd been hoping to breed. The thought made his jaw tighten. Every animal he sold was a step backward, a piece of the future slipping away. But then he thought about Daniel's glazed eyes, about the way Mara held her son like he was the most precious thing in the world. Some things were worth more than future plans. Jonah stood and walked to the edge of his porch, looking toward the shed. A faint light showed through the gaps in the door. Mara must have found the old lantern he kept in there. He could picture her inside, watching over her children, probably still scared, still uncertain of what tomorrow would bring. He knew the feeling. The night air was finally starting to cool. A breeze picked up, carrying the scent of dust and sage. Jonah breathed it in, this smell of the land he'd struggled with for so long. It was harsh country, unforgiving and hard. It took everything you had and asked for more. But it was also honest. The land didn't lie to you. It didn't make promises it couldn't keep. If you worked hard enough, if you were stubborn enough, if you refused to quit even when every sane voice said to give up, sometimes, it gave back. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles. The ride to town, the medicine, the questions about what came next. But tonight, 6 people were safe who hadn't been safe before. Tonight, children were sleeping with full bellies instead of slowly dying in a broken wagon. It wasn't much, but maybe it was enough to start with. Jonah took one last look at the stars, cold and distant and beautiful, then headed inside. He had a lot to do tomorrow, and the day would start early. It always did. 2. Dawn came too early, as it always did. Jonah was already awake when the first gray light crept through his window, had been awake for hours if he was being honest. Sleep had come in fits and starts, his mind too busy calculating costs and consequences to let him rest properly. He dressed quickly in the pre-dawn chill, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside to face whatever the day would bring. The air was cool, almost pleasant. In another hour the heat would return, but for now the world felt clean and new. Jonah walked toward the well, his footsteps loud in the morning quiet. He drew water for himself, splashed it on his face, and let the cold shock clear away the cobwebs of a restless night. Movement caught his eye. The door to the supply shed stood open, and Mara was there, already awake, already working. She carried a bucket toward the well, moving carefully as if her body ached. When she saw him, she stopped. "I didn't mean to wake you," she said. "You didn't. I'm always up early." Jonah gestured to the well. "Water's free. Take what you need." She nodded and continued forward. In the growing light, Jonah could see her more clearly than he had yesterday. She was thin, her cheekbones sharp, but there was strength in the set of her shoulders. She moved like someone who'd been carrying heavy loads for a long time and had learned how to bear the weight. "How's the boy?" Jonah asked. Mara's hands tightened on the bucket handle. "The fever's still high. He had a rough night. I'll ride to town this morning, get medicine from the doctor." "Mr. Reed, we can't—" "Jonah," he interrupted, "and we already covered this. Boy needs medicine. I'll get it." She looked at him for a long moment, and Jonah saw something shift in her expression. Not just gratitude this time, but a kind of measuring assessment, like she was trying to figure out what kind of man he really was. "Thank you, Jonah," she said finally. "When Daniel's better, we'll repay you, however long it takes. We'll worry about that later. Right now you need to focus on keeping him comfortable." Jonah turned toward the barn. "I'll bring breakfast before I leave." He was halfway across the yard when Mara called after him. "Jonah?" He stopped, looked back. "Let me cook it," she said. "Please, I need to do something useful." Jonah understood that feeling, the need to be productive when everything else felt like it was falling apart. He nodded. "Kitchen's in the house. Help yourself to whatever you find. Chickens might have laid overnight. Eggs are in the coop." He watched her hurry back to the shed, probably to check on her children before venturing into his house. Jonah continued to the barn, where Copper nickered a greeting. He fed her, mucked out her stall, and took his time with the morning chores. By the time he returned to the house, the smell of cooking food filled the air. Mara stood at his stove, her hair pulled back in a braid, working with the focused efficiency of someone who'd cooked thousands of meals. She'd found his cornmeal, his eggs wags, even the last of his bacon. A pan of scrambled eggs mixed with crumbled bacon sat on one side of the stove, and cornbread was baking in the oven. "Hope you don't mind," she said without turning around. "I saw the cornmeal and thought—" "It's fine," Jonah said. The truth was, his kitchen hadn't smelled this good in years. He cooked to survive, nothing more. Whatever Mara was making, it was something different. Thomas appeared in the doorway, hesitant. "Ma?" "Come in, sweetheart. Help me carry this back to the shed." The boy entered, his eyes taking in everything, the house, Jonah, the food on the stove. He moved like he was trying to take up as little space as possible, trying not to be a burden. Jonah recognized that careful politeness. He'd worn it himself as a child, after his mother died, and it was just him and his father scratching out a living. "You must be Thomas," Jonah said. "Yes, sir." The boy's voice was quiet but steady. "How old are you?" 12, sir. Almost 13. Almost 13. Same age Jonah had been when his mother passed, old enough to know that life was hard and help was rare. Mara pulled the cornbread from the oven and began dividing the food. She made 2 plates, one heaping with eggs and cornbread, the other with smaller portions. The larger plate she set on Jonah's table. The smaller one she handed to Thomas. "Take this to your sisters and Luke," she told her son. "Make sure Daniel gets some of the eggs, even if it's just a bite or two." Thomas took the plate carefully and disappeared. Mara turned to Jonah, gesturing to the table. "Sit. Eat while it's hot." "This is too much," Jonah said, looking at the generous portions. "You and the kids need—" "We ate," Mara interrupted firmly. "Not as much as you just gave us, but enough. You're riding to town in this heat. You need the strength." She wasn't going to budge on this. Jonah could see that. He sat down and took a bite of the eggs. They were perfectly seasoned, fluffy, better than anything he'd cooked in months. The cornbread was golden and still warm, with just the right amount of salt. "This is good," he said, and meant it. A small smile touched Mara's lips. "It's just eggs and cornbread." "Still good." They sat in silence for a moment, Jonah eating, Mara standing by the stove with her arms wrapped around herself like she didn't quite know what to do with idle hands. "Where were you headed?" Jonah asked. "Before the wagon broke." "West," Mara said. "California, supposedly. My husband heard there was work in the mines, good pay. He was always hearing about opportunities." Her voice carried the weight of old disappointments. "We'd been traveling for 2 months when the axle cracked. He said he'd go to the nearest town, get help, come back." She paused. "He's not coming back, is he?" Jonah could have lied, could have offered false hope, but she deserved the truth. "Probably not." Mara nodded slowly, like she'd just had something confirmed that she already knew. "I kept thinking maybe he got hurt, or lost, but deep down, I knew. He left us. Just like he left his family back in Ohio, just like he left every job he ever had when it got too hard. I'm sorry." "Don't be. I'm better off knowing." She met his eyes. "We all are. At least now I can stop waiting and start figuring out what comes next." There was steel in her voice, a determination that Jonah respected. She wasn't the kind to wallow in self-pity. She was already thinking ahead, already planning. "What will you do?" he asked. "I don't know yet, but we'll manage. We always have." She straightened her shoulders. "First, Daniel needs to get well. Then I'll figure out the rest." Jonah finished his breakfast and stood. "I should get going. Town's a good ride from here." "Be careful," Mara said. "And Jonah? Thank you. For everything." He nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude, and headed out to Saddle Copper. The sun was climbing now, the coolness of dawn already burning away. It was going to be another scorcher. The ride to town took 3 hours, and by the time Jonah saw the dusty buildings of Redemption rising from the plains, he was soaked with sweat. The town wasn't much, a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a scattering of other businesses. But it had a doctor, and that was what mattered. Jonah tied Copper to the hitching post outside Dr. Harrison's office and stepped into the relative cool of the building. The doctor was in, a gray-haired man with kind eyes and steady hands who'd patched up Jonah more times than he could count. "Jonah Reed," Dr. Harrison said, looking up from his desk. "What brings you to town? You don't look injured." "It's not for me. I've got a sick child at my place. Boy, about 4 years old, high fever, been like that for 2 days at least." The doctor's expression turned serious. "How high?" "Hot to the touch. Glazed eyes. Won't eat much. Could be any number of things. Heat exhaustion, infection, fever from bad water." Dr. Harrison stood and moved to his medicine cabinet. "I can give you something to bring the fever down, but if it doesn't break in a day or two, you'll need to bring the boy in." "I'll do that." Jonah watched the doctor measure out powder into small paper packets. "What do I owe you?" $2. Jonah pulled the money from his pocket, money he'd been saving for winter supplies, and handed it over. Dr. Harrison gave him the medicine along with detailed instructions. "Mix this with water, get him to drink it 3 times a day. Keep him cool, wet cloths on his forehead. And Jonah?" The doctor looked at him seriously. "If he gets worse, don't wait. Bring him in right away." "I will." "Thanks, Doc." Jonah stepped back into the heat and untied Copper. He was about to mount when a voice called out behind him. "Reed!" Jonah turned to see Caleb Morton riding toward him. Morton owned the neighboring ranch, a bigger spread with more cattle and more water. He was a hard man, the kind who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. "Morton," Jonah said evenly. Morton pulled his horse to a stop. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with a face weathered by years of sun and wind. "Heard you took in some travelers. Woman with a bunch of kids." Word traveled fast in small communities. Jonah kept his expression neutral. "That's right." "That's a mistake, Reed. You can barely feed yourself." "How you planning to feed 6 more mouths?" "That's my concern, not yours." "It becomes my concern when you start asking for credit around town because you're supporting vagrants." Morton leaned forward in his saddle. "You know what happens when you take in strays. They settle in. They get comfortable. Next thing you know, they think they own the place. They're not strays. They're people who needed help. People you don't know. People who'll bleed you dry and move on the first chance they get." Morton's voice hardened. "Listen to me, Reed. You're too soft-hearted for this country. This land doesn't reward kindness. It rewards strength. You let those people stay, and you'll lose everything your father built." Jonah felt his temper rising but kept it in check. "My father taught me that a man helps those who need helping. I'm doing what he would have done." "Your father died broken, working himself to death on land that gave nothing back. That the legacy you want?" Morton shook his head. "Send them on their way, Reed, before you regret it." "I appreciate your concern," Jonah said, his voice cold, "but I'll handle my own affairs." He mounted Copper and rode away before Morton could say anything else. But the man's words followed him, nagging at the edges of his mind. Morton was right about one thing. Jonah was barely making it as it was. Taking on 6 more people was either the act of a good man or a fool, and he wasn't entirely sure which. The ride back seemed longer than the ride out. The sun beat down without mercy, and Jonah's thoughts churned like storm clouds. What was he doing? He had no plan, no way to feed these people long term, no idea what would happen when winter came. But then he thought about Daniel's fever, about Mara's determination, about Thomas's careful politeness, and the way those children had shared the water without fighting over it. They deserved a chance. Everyone deserved a chance. When he finally reached his ranch, the sun was past its zenith. He rode up to find something unexpected. The yard had been transformed. Someone had swept the porch, organized the scattered tools that had been lying around, even repaired a broken step he'd been meaning to fix for months. Thomas was in the barn, mucking out stalls. Sarah and Emma were feeding the chickens, their high voices calling to the birds. Luke was carrying water from the well, his small bucket only half full, but his face set with concentration. And Mara was in the garden, or what had once been a garden, before Jonah had given up on it. She was on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds from around the withered vegetables he'd planted in spring and then forgotten. Her hands moved quickly, efficiently, piling the dead weeds to one side. Jonah dismounted and walked over to her. She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun. "You found the medicine?" she asked. "Right here." He patted his pocket. "How's Daniel?" "The same, maybe a little worse." Worry creased her forehead. "I've been keeping him cool, giving him water, but let's get this medicine in him." Jonah helped her to her feet. "And Mara? You didn't need to do all this." She looked around at the cleaned yard, the organized tools. "Yes, I did. You gave us shelter and food. The least we can do is help with the work." "That wasn't the deal." "There was no deal," Mara said firmly. "But if we're going to stay here, even for a little while, we'll earn our keep. I won't have my children learning to take without giving back." The steel was back in her voice, and Jonah recognized that he wasn't going to win this argument. Maybe he didn't want to. Having help around the place, even from children, made a difference he hadn't expected. They went to the shed where Daniel lay on his blanket, his small face flushed and damp. Mara sat beside him and carefully measured out the medicine according to Dr. Harrison's instructions, mixing it with water. She held the cup to Daniel's lips. "Come on, sweetheart," she murmured. "Just a few sips. It'll help you feel better." The boy managed to swallow some of the mixture before turning his head away. Mara tried again, patient and persistent, until he'd taken enough. Then she laid him back down and placed a cool, wet cloth on his forehead. "Now we wait," she said quietly. Jonah stood in the doorway, feeling useless. This was a mother's work, a kind of caring he didn't know how to do. "I'll let you tend to him," I've got chores. But when he stepped outside, Thomas was already there, having finished with the barn. Sir, is there something else I can help with? Jonah looked at the boy's earnest face. You don't have to call me sir. Jonah's fine. Yes, sir. I mean Jonah. Thomas shifted his weight. What needs doing? The fence needs mending on the south pasture, but that's heavy work. I can do heavy work, Thomas said quickly. I'm strong. He wasn't. Not yet. He was too thin, still recovering from days without proper food. But Jonah saw the need in the boy's eyes, the desperate desire to prove himself useful. All right, Jonah said. Come on. I'll show you how to twist wire. They worked together through the afternoon heat, Jonah teaching and Thomas learning fast. The boy had good hands and didn't complain, even when the wire bit into his palms or the sun beat down hard enough to make spots dance in front of their eyes. You've done this before, Jonah observed. A little. My father, he... Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully. He wasn't much for staying in one place. We moved a lot. But wherever we went, I tried to learn what I could. Figure I might need those skills someday. Smart thinking. They worked in silence for a while, the rhythmic twist of wire and pound of hammer becoming almost meditative. Finally, Thomas spoke again. Jonah, are you going to make us leave? The question was quiet, almost afraid. Jonah stopped working and looked at the boy. What makes you ask that? I heard you talking to that man in town. I was in the barn, but the door was open. He said we'd bleed you dry, that we'd take everything. Thomas met Jonah's eyes. We won't, I promise. Ma and me will work hard, the girls too. We won't be a burden. Thomas, Jonah said carefully, you're not a burden, and I'm not making you leave. Not until Daniel's well and you're all strong enough to travel. After that, he paused, realizing he hadn't thought that far ahead. After that, we'll figure it out. Relief flooded the boy's face. Thank you. We'll make it right, I promise. Stop promising and get back to work, Jonah said, but there was no harshness in his voice. They finished the fence as the sun began its descent. On the way back to the house, they found Sarah and Emma had collected eggs, and Luke had managed to carry enough water to fill the trough. The children moved with purpose, each finding tasks without being told. That evening, Mar cooked again, beans and cornbread. Simple food, but well made. They ate outside in the cooling air, Jonah and the 5 older members of the family, while Mara stayed in the shed with Daniel. Is your brother going to be okay? Jonah asked Sarah. The little girl looked up at him with solemn eyes. Ma says the medicine will help. She's always right about things like that. I'm sure she is, Jonah said, though he wasn't sure at all. Fevers could break, or they could get worse. Children could recover, or they could fade away. He'd seen both happen. After dinner, the children helped clean up without being asked. They moved like a small, efficient unit, each knowing their role. Emma washed the dishes in a basin. Sarah dried them. Luke put them away, standing on a crate to reach the shelves. Thomas swept the porch. Jonah watched them work and thought about Morton's words. These weren't people looking for a handout. They were survivors, doing whatever it took to keep going. There was dignity in that. As darkness fell, the children returned to the shed. Jonah sat on his porch, listening to the night sounds. Crickets, the distant howl of coyotes, the soft murmur of Mara's voice reading to her children from a worn book she'd salvaged from the wagon. The next morning brought more of the same. The Hale family rose with the sun and scattered to work. Thomas helped Jonah with the morning chores. Mara tended the garden and cooked. The younger children fed animals and carried water. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ranch began to look different. The tools that had been scattered found homes in the barn. The porch that had been dusty became clean. The garden that had been overrun with weeds showed patches of dark earth and struggling plants that might yet survive. Daniel's fever held steady for 2 days, neither better nor worse. Mara gave him the medicine faithfully, kept him cool, held him when he cried out in fevered dreams. Jonah could see the toll it was taking on her, the dark circles under her eyes, the tightness around her mouth, but she never complained. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Jonah was in the barn when Mara came running, her face alight with relief and joy. It broke, she said, breathless. The fever broke. He's sleeping now, really sleeping, not that restless tossing. And he's cooler, much cooler. But that's good news, Jonah said, feeling his own tension ease. He hadn't realized how much he'd been worrying until the worry lifted. It's the medicine. What you brought. Mara's eyes filled with tears. You saved his life, Jonah. You saved my boy. The doctor saved him. I just rode to town. You did more than that. Mara wiped her eyes impatiently. You took us in when you had no reason to. You shared what little you had. She trailed off, shaking her head. Why? Why did you help us? Jonah thought about that question. He could have given her a simple answer, because it was the right thing to do, because his father had taught him to help people in need. But standing there in the barn with dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight, he realized it was more complicated than that. I was alone out here, he said slowly. Had been for a long time. After my father died, I just kept going. Working, surviving, not really living. And then I saw you and your children in that wagon, and I thought about how it would feel to be that desperate, that scared. I couldn't leave you there. You could have, Mara said softly. Most people would have. Maybe, but I'm not most people, I guess. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and Jonah felt something shift between them. Not romance. It was too soon for that, and they both carried too much weight from the past. But understanding, maybe. Recognition of shared strength and shared struggle. I should get back to Daniel, Mara said finally. Go on. And Mara? I'm glad he's going to be okay. She smiled, and it transformed her face, made her look younger and lighter. Then she hurried back to the shed. Jonah returned to his work, but his mind kept drifting. The ranch felt different now, fuller. It was still hard, still a daily battle against heat and drought and the slow entropy that tried to drag everything down. But it didn't feel quite so lonely. That afternoon, Caleb Morton rode up again. Jonah saw him coming and walked out to meet him, aware of Thomas watching from the barn and Mara pausing in the garden. Reed, Morton said, not dismounting. Morton, I see your guests are still here, making themselves comfortable. They're helping with the work, earning their keep. Morton looked around at the cleaned yard, the organized tools, the tended garden. His expression hardened. You're making a mistake. Those people will own you before you know it. You'll be working to support them instead of yourself. That's not how I see it. Then you're a fool. Morton leaned forward. I'm telling you this as a neighbor, Reed. Send them on their way, before they cost you everything. And I'm telling you as a neighbor, Morton, back off. What I do on my land is my business. For a moment, Morton's face darkened with anger. Then he pulled back, his expression going cold and distant. Have it your way. But when this falls apart, don't come looking for help from me. He wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the air. Jonah watched him go, feeling the weight of the warning settle on his shoulders. Thomas appeared at his elbow. Is he going to make trouble? Maybe, Jonah admitted. Morton's not a man who likes being told no. We could leave, Thomas said quietly. If our being here is going to cause problems, you're not leaving, not yet. Jonah turned to look at the boy. And when you do leave, it'll be because you're ready to, not because someone like Morton pressured us. Thomas nodded, but worry remained in his eyes. That evening, Daniel sat up for the first time in days. He was weak and pale, but his eyes were clear, and he managed to eat some broth Mara had made. The other children gathered around him, their relief palpable. Jonah stood in the doorway of the shed, watching the reunion. 5 children and their mother crowded into a space that was never meant to house people, making do with what they had. They should have looked miserable, but they didn't. They looked like a family. Later, after the children had settled down to sleep, Mara joined Jonah on the porch. The night air was cool and welcome after the day's heat. Daniel asked about you, she said. Asked who the man was who got him the medicine. What did you tell him? That you're a friend. I hope that's all right. It's fine, Jonah said, though the word friend felt strange. He'd been alone so long he'd almost forgotten what friendship felt like. They sat in silence, listening to the night. Finally, Mara spoke. That man who came today, the one who warned you about us, He's right, you know. Jonah looked at her. About what? About us being a burden. About this costing you. She wrapped her arms around herself. We eat your food, use your water, take up your time and space. You'd be better off without us. If I thought that, I would have said so. Would you? Mara turned to face him. Or are you too decent to admit you made a mistake? You're not a mistake, Jonah said firmly. And yeah, feeding 7 people is harder than feeding 1. But look around, Mara. This place is in better shape than it's been in months. The work's getting done. Things I'd let slide because I couldn't find the time or energy, they're getting fixed. That's not enough to... It's enough for now, Jonah interrupted. Look, I'm not going to lie to you. Winter's coming, and that's going to be hard. Money's tight. Food's limited. But we'll figure it out, one day at a time. Mara studied his face in the starlight. Why are you doing this? Really? Jonah thought about the question seriously. Because I can, he said finally. Because I have this land, this house, this barn. I have walls and a roof and a well that gives good water. And you needed those things. It's that simple. Nothing's that simple. Maybe not. But I'm going to act like it is anyway. He stood. Get some rest, Mara. Tomorrow's another long day. She rose too, hesitating at the edge of the porch. Jonah? Thank you. For everything. And I meant what I said. We'll repay you, however long it takes. I know you will, Jonah said. And somehow, he believed it. She disappeared into the shed, and Jonah remained on the porch, looking up at the stars. Morton's warning echoed in his mind, mixing with Mara's concerns and his own doubts. This was risky. This was probably foolish. This could very well cost him everything. But when he thought about sending them away, about watching those children walk back into the desert with nowhere to go and no one to help them, he knew he couldn't do it. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The land stretched out before him, dark and vast, under the star-filled sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and another answered. The sound was lonely, wild, and beautiful, a reminder that this was hard country, unforgiving country, but it was also home, and maybe, just maybe, it had room for a few more people who were willing to work for their place in it. The days that followed Daniel's recovery fell into a rhythm that felt almost natural. Jonah woke before dawn, and by the time he reached the well, Thomas was already there, hauling water for the animals. Mara had coffee brewing on the stove. Real coffee, made from the small bag Jonah had been hoarding for special occasions, though he hadn't protested when she'd found it and decided his kindness qualified as special enough. The girls swept and organized. Luke practiced his letters in the dirt with a stick, and slowly, quietly, the Reed Ranch began to feel less like a lonely outpost and more like a place where people actually lived. But summer in the Colorado Territory was a season of extremes, and the heat that had nearly killed the Hale family was only the first danger it carried. It started in town. Jonah heard about it when he rode in for supplies 3 weeks after finding Mara and her children. The general store owner, a talkative man named Henderson, leaned across the counter with the eager expression of someone about to share important news. You heard about the sickness? Henderson asked. Jonah's hand stilled on the bag of flour he was examining. What sickness? Fever. Started over in Cottonwood Creek, spread to Miller Station. Doc Harrison says it's moving this way. Henderson lowered his voice. Already took 3 children and an old man. Comes on fast. Fever, chills, then worse. Doc's seen it before, says it runs through communities like wildfire in dry grass. The words hit Jonah like a physical blow. He thought immediately of Daniel, still weak from his own recent fever. Of Sarah and Emma and Luke. Of Mara, who'd already lost so much. What's Harrison doing about it? Jonah asked. What can he do? He's got medicine, but not enough for everyone. And it don't always work anyway. Henderson shook his head. Best thing is to stay away from town. Keep to yourself until it passes. These things burn themselves out eventually. Jonah paid for his supplies and rode home faster than he should have. Copper's hooves churning up dust on the dry road. When he reached the ranch, he found Mara in the garden, her hands dark with soil. She looked up at his approach and immediately read something in his expression. What's wrong? She asked, standing. There's sickness in the towns east of here, fever. Henderson says it's spreading. Jonah dismounted. We need to be careful. Keep the children close, away from anyone passing through. Fear flickered across Mara's face, but she pushed it down with visible effort. Daniel's still not fully strong. If he caught something else, he won't. We'll make sure of it. Jonah tried to sound more confident than he felt. Where is he now? Resting in the shed. The heat wore him out this morning. They walked together toward the shed, and Jonah felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. It wasn't just his own survival anymore. 6 other people depended on his decisions, his ability to keep them safe. For 2 weeks, they were careful. No trips to town except when absolutely necessary. No contact with the occasional travelers who passed on the distant road. The children stayed close to the ranch, and Mara watched them with an intensity that spoke of her own fears. The heat intensified as August approached, turning the air thick and oppressive. The kind of heat that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. At night, they slept with windows open, hoping for any breath of cool air. During the day, they worked in the early morning and late evening, hiding from the sun during its worst hours. Thomas had grown stronger over the weeks, his frame filling out with regular meals. He worked alongside Jonah now with real competence, no longer just learning, but contributing. The boy had a good mind and steady hands, and Jonah found himself relying on him more than he'd expected. They were mending fence on the north pasture when Thomas spoke up, his voice uncertain. Jonah, can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why didn't you ever marry? Have a family of your own? Jonah hammered in a post, considering the question. It wasn't something he talked about, but Thomas had earned some honesty. I was engaged once. Girl named Catherine from town. Pretty, smart, had plans for what our life would be like. He paused, testing the post's stability. But she wanted me to sell the ranch, move somewhere with more opportunity. Said this land would break me like it broke my father. What did you do? Told her I couldn't sell. This was my father's dream, his legacy. I owed it to him to make it work. Jonah picked up another post. She left, married a banker in Denver, probably has a nice house, easier life. Do you regret it? Some days. Jonah met the boy's eyes. But this land, hard as it is, it's mine. I built something here, even if it's not much. That means something. Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing this. My father never built anything, just talked about what he was going to build someday. Ma used to believe him, but after a while she stopped. I think that's what hurt her most. Not that we were poor, but that we were poor because he wouldn't stick with anything long enough to make it work. Your mother's a strong woman. Yeah. Pride filled Thomas's voice. She kept us together when anyone else would have given up. When Pa left, I was angry, but now I think maybe we're better off. They worked in silence after that, the conversation settling into something deeper than words. Jonah understood what the boy was really saying, that this ranch, this hard life, felt more real and solid than anything his father had promised. That evening, Luke complained of feeling tired. Mara put him to bed early, attributing it to the heat and a long day of play. But when Jonah checked on him before heading to his own house, the boy's forehead felt warm. It's probably nothing, Mara said, but her voice was tight with worry. Just tired, like I said. Jonah wanted to believe her, but he'd heard the tremor beneath her words, seen the way her hand lingered on Luke's forehead, as if she could will away any sickness through sheer determination. By morning, Luke was worse. The fever that had seemed mild the night before had spiked. The boy shivered despite the growing heat, his teeth chattering, his small body racked with chills that no amount of blankets could stop. Mara sat beside him, her face pale. It's the sickness from town. It has to be. We don't know that, Jonah said, but he was lying and they both knew it. The symptoms matched what Henderson had described: sudden onset, high fever, violent chills. He needs medicine, the same kind you got for Daniel. Mara looked up at Jonah, and he saw desperation beginning to crack through her controlled exterior. Please. I'll go to town right now. The heat. I'll manage. Jonah was already moving toward the door. Keep him cool. Water, wet cloths, like before. I'll be back as fast as I can. He saddled Copper with shaking hands, his mind racing. The ride to town took 3 hours in normal conditions. In this heat, pushing hard, maybe he could make it in 2.5. Then the ride back. 5 hours minimum, probably closer to 6. A lot could happen in 6 hours to a sick child. Thomas appeared as Jonah was tightening the saddle. I'm coming with you. No, your mother needs you here. 2 riders can trade off, keep the horses fresher. We'll make better time. The boy's jaw was set, stubborn. Luke's my brother. I'm coming. Jonah wanted to argue, but Thomas was right. And there was something in the boy's eyes that reminded Jonah of himself at that age. The need to do something, anything, rather than sit helpless while someone you loved suffered. Get your mother's permission, then saddle the old gelding. We leave in 5 minutes. They rode out as the sun climbed higher, already turning the air to liquid heat. Copper was strong and steady, but the gelding was older, slower. Still, having 2 horses meant they could spell each other, and Thomas sat his mount with competence born of necessity. The landscape shimmered in the heat, turning familiar landmarks strange and dreamlike. Jonah had made this ride dozens of times, knew every rock and rise, but the oppressive temperature made it feel like traveling through hostile territory. Sweat soaked through his shirt within the first mile. His canteen, full when they started, was half empty before they'd covered a quarter of the distance. Drink, he told Thomas, passing the canteen. Small sips, but drink regular. The boy obeyed, then passed it back. They pushed on. Halfway to town, Copper stumbled. Just a slight misstep, but it sent alarm through Jonah. He pulled her up, dismounted, checked her legs and hooves. Nothing obviously wrong, but she was laboring, her breath coming hard. We need to slow down, Thomas said. We can't. Luke, won't be helped if we kill the horses getting there. Thomas's voice was steady, mature beyond his years. We push them too hard in this heat. They'll go down. Then we're stuck. Jonah knew the boy was right, but the knowledge tasted like ash. Every minute mattered. Every minute Luke's fever burned was a minute closer to... He couldn't finish the thought. They slowed to a walk, letting the horses catch their breath. The sun beat down mercilessly. In the distance, heat devils danced across the plains, phantom water that promised relief but delivered nothing. Tell me about your father, Thomas said suddenly. Jonah glanced at him, surprised. Why? Because we need to think about something other than how hot it is and how far we still have to go. The boy's face was red, sweat-streaked. Please. So Jonah talked about his father, about the early days of the ranch, about the dreams they'd had and the reality that had replaced them, about hard winters and dry summers, about cattle lost to disease and crops that failed, about the slow, grinding work of trying to make something out of nothing. And as he talked, the miles passed. Not quickly, but steadily. They reached town in just under 3 hours, both riders and horses exhausted but still functional. Dr. Harrison's office was closed. A sign on the door read, "Making house calls. Return uncertain." Jonah felt panic rise in his throat. He hammered on the door anyway, knowing it was futile but unable to stop himself. No answer. The street was eerily quiet, fewer people out than usual. Those who were out moved quickly, avoiding each other. The sickness, Thomas said quietly. It's here. Jonah tried the general store. Henderson was there, but his usual chattiness was gone, replaced by nervous efficiency. Doc's over at the Pritchard place, Henderson said. Whole family came down with it. Don't know when he'll be back. I need medicine. The fever medicine he gave me before. Henderson shook his head. Don't have any. Doc took the last of it with him. More's supposed to come in on next week's supply wagon, but... He spread his hands helplessly. There has to be something. There isn't. I'm sorry, Reed. Half the town's sick or caring for someone who is. Doc's doing what he can, but there's just not enough medicine to go around. Jonah stood frozen, his mind refusing to accept what he was hearing. He'd ridden 3 hours in killing heat, pushed Copper to her limits, brought Thomas away from his sick brother, and there was nothing. No medicine. No help. Where's the Pritchard place? He heard himself ask. 2 miles north of town. But Reed, the doc's busy. He can't... Jonah was already moving. Back outside, back to Copper, who stood with her head lowered, exhausted. Thomas followed without question. The Pritchard farm was easy to find. Several horses were tied outside, and when Jonah knocked, a harried-looking woman answered. We don't need any more visitors, she said tiredly. The sickness... I need to see Dr. Harrison. Please, I have a sick child at home. The woman's expression softened slightly. Everyone has a sick someone. Doc's with my husband and 2 of my children right now. You'll have to wait. She started to close the door, but Jonah put his hand against it. Not forcefully, but firmly. I'll wait, however long it takes. The woman studied him, then nodded and let the door swing open. In the parlor, don't touch anything. They waited in a small, stuffy room that smelled of sickness and fear. Thomas sat rigidly beside Jonah, his hands clenched in his lap. Through the walls came the sounds of coughing, of Dr. Harrison's calm voice giving instructions, of someone crying. An hour passed, then another. The heat in the closed room became stifling. Jonah's clothes stuck to his skin, and his head began to pound. Beside him, Thomas had gone pale and quiet. Drink some water, Jonah told him. The canteen's almost empty. Drink it anyway. Thomas took a small sip, then offered the canteen back. Jonah shook his head. You keep it. Finally, after what felt like days but was probably closer to 3 hours, Dr. Harrison emerged. He looked ancient, worn down to nothing by the weight of too much suffering and too little he could do about it. When he saw Jonah, recognition flickered in his tired eyes. Reed, what are you doing here? I need medicine. The boy at my place, one of the children I told you about, he's got the fever, the same kind that's going around. Dr. Harrison's shoulders sagged. I don't have any to spare. What I've got is being rationed for the worst cases, and even then, there's not enough. Please, Jonah said, and hated the desperation in his own voice. He's 7 years old. He's already weak from the heat. If this fever takes hold, I know. The doctor's voice was heavy. I know what happens. I've seen it happen to 6 people this week alone. But I can't help everyone, Reed. I have to make choices, and those choices are... He stopped, rubbed his face. I'm sorry. Jonah felt the world tilt. This couldn't be happening. He'd done everything right. He'd come to town, found the doctor, done what needed doing, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Thomas stood abruptly. His face was flushed, his breathing rapid. Sir, he said to the doctor, and his voice shook. Sir, please. Luke, he's just a little boy. He never hurt anybody. He's good and kind, and he tries so hard to help even when he's too small to do much. If you just give us some medicine, we'll pay you back. I'll work for you. I'll do anything. Just please. The boy's voice broke. He stood there, trembling, fighting tears with everything he had. And in that moment, Dr. Harrison's expression changed. The professional detachment cracked, and Jonah saw the man underneath, the one who'd become a doctor because he wanted to help people, not turn them away. Wait here, Dr. Harrison said quietly. He disappeared into the back of the house. Jonah put a hand on Thomas's shoulder, felt the boy shaking. You did good, he said softly. I begged, Thomas whispered. I begged like Pa used to beg when he needed drinking money. No, you asked for help for someone you love. That's different. That takes courage. Dr. Harrison returned carrying a small cloth bag. He pressed it into Jonah's hands. This is half my supply. I'm trusting you to use it wisely. Same dosage as before, 3 times a day. If the fever doesn't break in 2 days, there's nothing more I can do. How much? Nothing. Just make sure that boy lives. Make all this mean something. The doctor's eyes were haunted. Now go, before I remember all the other people who need this just as badly. Jonah and Thomas stumbled out into the late afternoon heat. The sun had passed its peak, but still burned with intensity. Copper and the gelding stood where they'd been left, heads low, clearly suffering. We can't push them hard, Thomas said, not after standing in this heat for hours. I know. Jonah secured the medicine carefully in his saddlebag. But we can't stay here either. We'll go slow and steady, stop for water breaks, get home when we get home. They mounted and started back. The return journey was a nightmare of heat and exhaustion and growing fear. Every mile seemed to stretch longer than the last. The horses plodded forward with mechanical determination, and Jonah could hear Copper's labored breathing. The sun began to sink toward the horizon, and the temperature dropped slightly. Not much, but enough to notice. They'd been riding for hours, taking frequent breaks, when Jonah realized something was wrong with Thomas. The boy was swaying in his saddle, his face dangerously flushed. "Thomas?" No answer. The boy's eyes were unfocused. "Thomas!" Jonah pulled Copper alongside the gelding. Thomas looked at him without recognition, then slumped forward. Jonah grabbed him before he could fall, his heart hammering. The boy's skin was burning up. Heat exhaustion, maybe heat stroke. They'd been out in the sun all day, riding hard, and Thomas had given most of the water to Jonah. "Damn it," Jonah breathed. He looked around desperately. They were still miles from home, the landscape empty in all directions. Copper was exhausted. The gelding was in better shape, but not by much. He had to make a choice. Stop here, try to treat Thomas with no water and no shelter. Or push on, risk making everything worse, but get them home where Mara could help. Jonah chose. He tied Thomas to the gelding's saddle as securely as he could, then remounted Copper. Leading the gelding, he urged both horses forward. Not fast, but steady. One foot in front of another, 1 mile and then another. The sun touched the horizon. The sky turned gold, then orange, then red. Beautiful and indifferent. Jonah talked to Copper, to the gelding, to Thomas, who couldn't hear him. He talked to keep himself focused, to push back the fog that threatened to cloud his own thinking. "Almost there," he said. "Just a little further. You can do this. We can all do this." His own vision started to blur. Sweat had long since stopped flowing. He was too dehydrated. His lips were cracked and bleeding, but the ranch was close now. He recognized that outcropping of rock, that twisted tree. Close. So close. Copper stumbled again, and this time she went down. Jonah tried to jump clear, but wasn't fast enough. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Pain exploded through his shoulder. He lay there, stunned, staring up at the darkening sky. Every part of his body screamed at him to stay down, to just rest for a minute. But Thomas was tied to a horse that could wander off. And Luke was home, burning with fever, and Mara was waiting, trusting him to come back with help. Jonah forced himself to his feet. His shoulder blazed with pain, but nothing felt broken. Copper was trying to stand, her legs shaking. He helped her up, checked her over. She was done. Couldn't go another step. The ranch was maybe half a mile away. He could see the buildings in the gathering darkness. Jonah untied Thomas from the gelding and pulled the boy across his good shoulder. The weight nearly drove him back to the ground, but he locked his knees and stayed upright. With his other hand, he grabbed the gelding's reins and started walking. One step, another, another. The medicine bag bounced against his side. Thomas's breath was hot against his neck. The gelding followed reluctantly, as exhausted as Jonah. Lights appeared ahead. Mara had lit lanterns around the ranch. Jonah fixed his eyes on them and kept moving. His legs felt like they were made of lead. His shoulders screamed. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, the lights at the end the only thing keeping him upright. He made it to the yard before his legs finally gave out. He went down on his knees, still holding Thomas, trying to break the boy's fall with his own body. "Jonah!" Mara's voice, distant and echoing. Hands on him, trying to help. He pushed the medicine bag toward her with numb fingers. "Luke," he managed. "For Luke." Then the darkness closed in, and he knew nothing more. Consciousness returned in fragments. The cool touch of water on his lips, voices murmuring nearby, pain radiating through his shoulder in waves that made breathing difficult. Jonah tried to open his eyes, but his eyelids felt weighted down, refusing to cooperate. He managed a slight movement, a groan escaping his throat before he could stop it. "He's waking up." That was Mara's voice, close by, tinged with relief and exhaustion. "Should I get more water?" A younger voice. Sarah, maybe. "Yes, sweetheart, and bring another cloth." Jonah forced his eyes open. The world swam into focus slowly. Rough wooden beams overhead, the familiar smell of his own house, lamplight casting soft shadows. He was in his bed, covered with blankets despite the warmth. His shirt was gone, and something cool pressed against his forehead. Mara's face appeared above him, lined with worry but breaking into a tentative smile when their eyes met. "Welcome back," she said softly. "You gave us quite a scare." "Thomas," Jonah croaked, his throat raw as sandpaper. "Luke." Both alive, both recovering. Mara's hand touched his arm gently. Thanks to you. Memory flooded back, the desperate ride to town, the doctor's reluctance, Thomas's collapse, the nightmarish journey home. Jonah tried to sit up, but pain lanced through his shoulder, and Mara pressed him firmly back down. Don't even think about it, she said with quiet authority. You've been unconscious for nearly 2 days. Your shoulder's badly bruised, you were severely dehydrated, and you pushed yourself well past any reasonable limit. You're staying in that bed until I say otherwise. 2 days? Jonah's mind struggled to process this. I can't. The animals, the chores, are being handled. Mara gestured toward the window, where morning light streamed through. Thomas is up and around, weak but functional. He's been teaching the girls how to manage the livestock. They're doing fine. Everything's fine. Sarah appeared with a cup of water and a fresh cloth. She looked at Jonah with wide, solemn eyes. You saved Luke, she said simply. And Thomas. Mama said you carried Thomas all the way home even though you could barely walk. Jonah accepted the water gratefully, his hands shaking as he brought the cup to his lips. The liquid was cool and sweet, the best thing he'd ever tasted. Just did what needed doing, he managed. You almost died doing it, Mara said, and there was an edge to her voice now, something sharp beneath the relief. When you collapsed in the yard, I thought... She stopped, composing herself. Thomas woke up before you did. He told me everything. How you gave him most of the water. How you kept going even when the heat was killing you. How you got the medicine when the doctor said there wasn't any. Half his supply, Jonah said, remembering. Is it enough? It was enough. Luke's fever broke yesterday morning. He's still weak, but he's going to be fine. Mara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. You saved my son, Jonah. Again, I don't know how to... Don't, Jonah interrupted gently. Please don't. I couldn't let him... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Mara nodded, understanding. She took the empty cup from his hands and stood. I'll bring you some broth. You need to eat, build your strength back, and then you're going to rest. No arguments. She left, Sarah trailing behind her. Jonah lay back against the pillows, his body aching in a dozen different places. 2 days. He'd lost 2 days to unconsciousness, and the ranch had kept functioning. The thought was strange, almost unsettling. For so long, this place had depended entirely on him. If he didn't do the work, it didn't get done. But now... Thomas appeared in the doorway, looking thin and pale, but upright. Can I come in? He asked. Of course you can. The boy entered hesitantly, as if afraid Jonah might disappear if he moved too quickly. I wanted to say thank you, Thomas said, for saving me. Ma told me I collapsed, that you carried me home. You got heat exhaustion. Happens to everyone out here sooner or later. You gave me the water. Ma said you barely drank anything yourself. Thomas's voice was quiet, but firm. You could have died because of me. Jonah looked at the boy, really looked at him. Thomas stood straighter now than when they'd first met, his shoulders squared despite his pallor. The fear and uncertainty that had marked him in those early days had been replaced by something else. Not confidence exactly, but a kind of quiet determination. Listen to me, Jonah said. What happened out there? That wasn't your fault. It was the heat, the distance, bad luck. You did everything right. You were brave when it mattered, smart when it counted. Your brother's alive because you came with me, because you convinced the doctor to help. Don't carry guilt that isn't yours to carry. Thomas's eyes brightened with moisture, but he blinked it back. I'll work harder, he said, to pay you back for everything. I promise. You already work hard enough. Maybe too hard for a boy your age. Jonah shifted slightly, trying to find a position that didn't aggravate his shoulder. But I appreciate it, knowing the ranch was in good hands while I was indisposed. A small smile crossed Thomas's face. The girls are naturals with the chickens. Emma's already named everyone. And Luke, even sick as he was, kept asking if the cow had been milked. Said it wasn't fair to make her uncomfortable just because he was ill. He's a good kid. They all are. They are, Thomas agreed. He paused, then added, Jonah? That man who came by before, the one who warned you about us. He came back yesterday. Jonah felt tension coil in his gut. Morton, what did he want? He saw Ma in the garden and rode over, asked where you were. When she told him you were sick, he said, Thomas hesitated. He said this is what happens when a man takes on more than he can handle, that you'd worked yourself to death trying to support people who weren't your responsibility. What did your mother say? A fiercer smile this time. She told him you were recovering just fine and that we were managing the ranch perfectly well without his concern or his advice. Told him if he had nothing helpful to contribute, he could see himself off the property. Despite the pain, Jonah felt a laugh building in his chest. She said that? Word for word. He didn't like it much, but he rode off. Thomas's expression grew more serious. He's going to cause trouble, isn't he? Maybe. Morton's not used to people standing up to him, especially women. Jonah carefully pushed himself more upright, ignoring the protest from his shoulder. But that's my problem to deal with, not yours. It's all our problem, Thomas said quietly. We're family now, aren't we? That's what Ma says. That family faces troubles together. The word hung in the air between them. Family. Jonah had been alone for so long that he'd almost forgotten what the word meant beyond the abstract. But looking at Thomas, thinking about Mara's fierce protectiveness and the children's determined efforts to help, he realized the boy was right. Somewhere in the past weeks, without him quite noticing when it happened, they'd become something more than strangers sharing space. Yeah, Jonah said finally. I guess we are. Mara returned with broth and cornbread, shooing Thomas out so Jonah could eat in peace. The food was simple but perfectly seasoned, and Jonah found himself hungrier than he'd realized. As he ate, Mara busied herself straightening the room, though there was little that needed straightening. You're nervous, Jonah observed. She stopped, turned to face him. I've been thinking, she said, about what happens next. You nearly died bringing medicine for Luke. The ranch barely survived 2 days without you working it. What happens when winter comes, when the real hard times hit? We'll manage. How? Mara's voice was sharp now, frustration breaking through. You're one man, Jonah. One man trying to run a ranch that's barely profitable, now supporting 7 people instead of 1. The numbers don't work. Even I can see that, and I don't know anything about ranching. So what are you suggesting? Mara sat down in the chair beside his bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I'm suggesting we need a real plan, not just surviving day to day, but actually building something sustainable. She took a breath. I'm suggesting that if we're going to stay here, and I think we both know we are, then we need to make this ranch work better than it's working now. Jonah studied her face, seeing the determination there, the sharp intelligence that poverty and hardship had never quite managed to dull. What did you have in mind? The garden's producing now. Not much, but enough to supplement what we're buying. If we expand it, plant more next season, we could preserve food for winter, can vegetables, dry beans, store root crops. She was speaking faster now, ideas tumbling out. And the chickens, we've got 8 laying hens, that's not enough. We should get more, sell eggs in town for cash money. That takes capital we don't have. I know, but I've been thinking about that too. Mara leaned forward. I can sew. Before I married, I worked in a dress shop. I'm good with a needle, fast, precise. If we could get fabric, I could make clothes, sell them in town. It wouldn't be much at first, but it would be something. Jonah considered this. It wasn't a bad idea, actually. The nearest dress shop was 15 miles away, and most ranch women made do with worn, practical clothing because nice things were hard to come by. Where would we get the fabric? I don't know yet. Maybe the general store would extend credit if I showed them samples of my work. Maybe we could trade something for it. Her jaw set stubbornly. I'll figure it out. The point is, I can contribute more than just cooking and cleaning. I can help make this place profitable. It's not your responsibility to— Yes, it is, Mara interrupted firmly. You took us in when you didn't have to. You risked your life for my children, twice. The least I can do is help make sure this ranch survives so you're not bankrupted by your own kindness. They looked at each other, and Jonah saw in her eyes a reflection of his own stubbornness, his own refusal to quit when things got hard. It occurred to him that they were more alike than he'd realized. 2 people who'd been knocked down by life and had simply refused to stay down. All right, he said, we'll try it your way. Expand the garden, get more chickens, see about the sowing. But Mara, I need you to understand something. This land is hard. It takes more than it gives most years. Even with all our efforts, we might still fail. Then we fail, Mara said simply. But at least we'll fail trying, not sitting around waiting for things to get better on their own. Over the next few days, Jonah recovered slowly. His shoulder remained painful but functional, and the exhaustion gradually lifted. Mara had been right. The ranch had survived without him. Thomas proved surprisingly capable, and even the younger children had stepped up, each finding ways to contribute. Daniel, now fully recovered from his fever, helped Luke feed the chickens every morning. The two youngest boys had developed a routine, working together with the easy companionship of siblings. Sarah and Emma had taken over laundry duties, hauling water and scrubbing clothes with a thoroughness that put Jonah's bachelor efforts to shame. And Mara had transformed the garden. What had been a neglected patch of struggling vegetables was now neat rows of healthy plants. Tomatoes, beans, squash, even some lettuce that somehow survived the heat. She worked in the early morning and late evening, coaxing life from the reluctant soil with the same determination she brought to everything else. Jonah was sitting on the porch, his shoulders still in a sling Mara had fashioned from an old shirt, when Caleb Morton rode up for the third time. The man's face was set in hard lines, and he didn't bother with pleasantries. "Reed, we need to talk." "Then talk." Morton dismounted, tied his horse, and stomped up onto the porch. "This has gone on long enough. That woman and her children have been here for over a month now. They're not guests anymore. They're squatters. They're helping run the ranch. They're bleeding you dry." Morton's voice rose. "I've seen this before, Reed. People take advantage of soft-hearted fools, make themselves indispensable, and the next thing you know, they're claiming rights to your property. That's not what's happening here, isn't it?" Morton leaned in close. "You nearly died running errands for them. Your ranch is being run by children and a woman. You're letting them make decisions about your land, your resources. How long before she's got you convinced you need to marry her for propriety's sake? How long before she's got legal claim to half of everything your father built?" Anger surged through Jonah, hot and immediate. He stood, ignoring the protest from his shoulder. "You're out of line, Morton." "I'm being honest. Someone needs to be." Morton straightened. "I came here as a neighbor to warn you, but I can see you're too far gone to listen. So let me be clear about something else. When this falls apart, and it will, don't expect any help from me. You made your choice. You live with the consequences." "I already am living with them," Jonah said coldly, "and I'll take those consequences over your kind of help any day." Morton's face darkened with rage. For a moment, Jonah thought the man might actually take a swing at him, but Morton controlled himself, stepped back, and headed toward his horse. "You're a fool, Reed," he said, mounting up, "and you'll regret this." He rode off, leaving Jonah standing on the porch, fists clenched. The confrontation had shaken something loose in him, anger at Morton's presumption, certainly, but also a deeper realization. The man was right about one thing. Decisions needed to be made. He couldn't keep operating in this undefined space where Mara and her children were both guests and workers, neither fully family nor fully employees. That evening, after the children had gone to bed in the shed, Jonah asked Mara to stay behind. She stood in the doorway, backlit by lamplight, waiting. "We need to talk," Jonah said. "About the future. About what this is." Mara's expression didn't change, but he saw her shoulders tense slightly. "All right." "Morton came by again today. Said some things, most of them ignorant and mean-spirited, but he raised a point I've been avoiding." Jonah chose his words carefully. "You and the children can't live in that shed forever. Winter's coming. It's not insulated, barely heated. You'll freeze. We've survived cold before." "I'm sure you have, but you don't need to, not when there's a better option." Jonah took a breath. "I'm going to build you a cabin. Small, but solid. Behind the barn, where there's good drainage and some shelter from the wind. It won't be fancy, but it'll be warm and dry, and yours." Mara stared at him. "Jonah, we can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." He held up a hand before she could protest further. "This isn't charity, Mara. This is practical. You're contributing to this ranch in real ways. You deserve proper housing. And besides, I've been thinking about what you said. about making this place sustainable. If we're going to do that, we need to think long term. And long term means proper shelter for everyone. A cabin, Mara said slowly, as if testing the word. Our own cabin. It'll take time to build. I'll need help, and I'm still recovering. But we can start with the foundation, get the frame up before the cold sets in. Even if we don't finish everything before winter, we can at least have the basic structure done. Mara moved closer, and in the lamplight Jonah could see tears tracking down her face. Not sad tears, but something else. Relief, gratitude, hope. Why are you doing this? She asked softly. Really? Not the practical reasons, the real reason. Jonah thought about that question, about all the reasons he could give. Because it was right, because his father would have done the same, because the ranch worked better with help. All true, but not quite complete. Because I'm tired of being alone, he said finally. Because for the first time in years, this place feels like more than just land and work. It feels like a home. And you and your children, you're a part of that. He met her eyes. I'm not asking for anything more than what we have right now. You do your work, I do mine. But I want you to have something solid, something that's yours. A place to build from. Mara nodded, unable to speak. She reached out and squeezed his hand briefly, then turned and hurried back to the shed. Jonah watched her go, feeling something settle in his chest, a rightness he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember. The next morning, he and Thomas began planning the cabin. They paced out dimensions behind the barn, marked corners with stakes, discussed where windows should go and how to orient the door for the best light and protection from weather. The girls came to watch, offering opinions on where things should be placed. Even Luke and Daniel joined in, dragging over rocks they thought might be useful for the foundation. It became a family project, everyone contributing ideas and labor. Word spread somehow, maybe through Henderson at the general store, maybe through one of the other ranchers who spotted the activity. A few days after they'd started digging the foundation trenches, a wagon rolled up carrying lumber, and a man Jonah recognized from town, Peter Caldwell, a carpenter who'd built half the structures in Redemption. Heard you were building a cabin, Caldwell said, climbing down from the wagon. Thought you might could use some proper lumber instead of whatever scrap you were planning to cobble together. Jonah stared at the wagon bed full of good, milled planks. Caldwell, I can't afford— Didn't ask you to pay, Caldwell interrupted. Consider it a loan. You can settle up when times are better, or consider it payment for all the times your father helped my family when we were struggling. He squinted at the foundation stakes. You're building it too small. That won't fit 6 people comfortably, not in winter when they're stuck inside. I was trying to keep costs down. False economy. Build it right the first time. Caldwell pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil, started sketching. Here's what you need. Main room here, sleeping loft above for the children, small room off the side for the lady, good stove placement, proper chimney, windows for cross breeze in summer. For the next hour, Caldwell walked them through a proper cabin design, making suggestions and corrections. When he finished, he handed the sketch to Jonah. I'll come back next week, help with the framing. Got other jobs to finish first. But Reed, you're doing a good thing here. Don't let anyone tell you different. He left before Jonah could thank him properly. Mara came over looking at the sketch with wide eyes. This is beautiful, she said. But Jonah, the cost— We'll figure it out, Jonah said, and realized he believed it. We always do. Work on the cabin became the rhythm of their days. Thomas proved adept with hammer and saw, his hands growing more skilled with each passing hour. The girls mixed mortar and carried water. Luke and Daniel cleared rocks from the site. Mara cooked and planned and managed logistics with the efficiency of a general. And Jonah, his shoulder healing slowly but surely, worked alongside them all, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Not just hope, that was too fragile, too easily crushed. This was something sturdier, purpose maybe, or belonging. 3 weeks into construction, with the foundation laid and the frame beginning to take shape, Caleb Morton rode up one last time. He didn't dismount, just sat on his horse, looking at the growing structure. So you're really doing this, he said. I am. Morton shook his head slowly. You're a stubborn fool, Reed. Probably, Jonah agreed, but I'm a fool with help. And you know what? That makes all the difference. He turned back to the cabin, expecting Morton to say something else, to issue more warnings or threats. But when he glanced back, the man was riding away, his posture stiff with disapproval. Thomas came to stand beside Jonah. Think he'll cause real trouble? Maybe, but we'll handle it when it comes. Jonah put a hand on the boy's shoulder. Right now, we've got a cabin to build. They worked until the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. As darkness fell, Mara called everyone to supper, a hearty stew made with vegetables from the garden and meat Jonah had traded for in town. They ate together in the cooling evening air, tired but satisfied, and looking around at the faces gathered in the lamplight, Thomas with his quiet competence, the girls with their chatter and laughter, the little boys already drowsy from the day's adventures, Mara with her gentle strength. Jonah felt something shift inside him. This was home. Not just the land or the buildings, but these people, this shared struggle and shared hope. For the first time since his father's death, Jonah Reed wasn't alone. And it made all the difference. The cabin rose from the earth like a promise made solid. Each board nailed into place, each stone fitted into the foundation, represented something more than simple construction. It was proof that dust and desperation could be transformed into something lasting, that strangers could become family, that a summer of unlikely chances could reshape into permanent hope. Peter Caldwell returned as promised, bringing not just his expertise but two of his sons who worked alongside Thomas and Jonah. The framing went up faster than expected, the structure taking shape with satisfying speed. Mara watched from the garden, her hands never idle, pulling weeds and harvesting vegetables while keeping one eye on the growing building that would become her family's home. Late August brought a shift in the weather. The brutal heat that had defined the summer began to ease, replaced by warm days and cooler nights that hinted at the autumn to come. The change felt symbolic to Jonah, as if the land itself was acknowledging that something had fundamentally altered on the Reed Ranch. The garden had exceeded all expectations. Mara's knowledge and tireless work had coaxed abundance from soil Jonah had written off as barely productive. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, beans climbed their supports in profusion, and squash sprawled across carefully tended beds. She'd even managed to grow lettuce through the worst of the heat by rigging a shade cloth that protected the delicate plants during the hottest hours. "We'll need to start preserving soon," Mara said one evening as they surveyed the garden together. "The tomatoes are coming in faster than we can eat them, and the beans aren't far behind." "I've got some jars in the cellar," Jonah offered. "My mother used to can. Haven't done it myself in years." "I know how," Mara said. "My grandmother taught me. We'll need more jars, though, and sugar for some of the preserves. Maybe some salt for pickling." Jonah mentally calculated the cost, weighing it against their limited funds. But before he could voice his concern, Mara continued. "I finished 3 dresses this week. Henderson at the general store thinks he can sell them. He's offered to take them on consignment, give us store credit for half the value up front and the rest when they sell." Jonah looked at her with newfound respect. "When did you arrange this?" "Last week when Thomas and I went to town for nails. I showed Henderson some of my work, explained our situation. He said he'd been getting requests for quality dresses, that the women around here are tired of catalog goods that don't fit right." A small smile played at her lips. "He thinks I could make a real business of it if I can produce steadily." "Mara, that's—" Jonah shook his head in amazement. "That's remarkable." "It's survival," she corrected gently. "Same as everything else we're doing. But yes, it feels good. To contribute something beyond just housework, to know I can help make this place sustainable." The word sustainable had become something of a mantra between them. Not just surviving day to day, but building something that could weather storms, something that would last beyond a single season. It was ambitious, maybe even audacious given their circumstances, but Jonah found himself believing it might actually be possible. The cabin's roof went on in early September, a moment of celebration marked by Caldwell and his sons joining them for supper. Mara had made her best meal yet. Roasted chicken from one of their older hens, vegetables from the garden prepared a dozen different ways, bread so light it seemed to float on the plate. "You've got something special here, Reed," Caldwell said, leaning back with contentment. "Not just the cabin, though that's solid work, but this." He gestured around at the children playing in the yard, at Mara serving seconds, at Thomas and his sons talking about woodworking techniques. This feels like a real homestead, like a place people actually live, not just survive. Jonah understood what he meant. The ranch had changed in ways that went beyond the physical improvements. There was laughter here now, voices calling to each other across the yard, the comfortable chaos of children and chores and shared meals. The loneliness that had defined this place for so long had been replaced by something warmer, something that made the hard work feel worthwhile. After Caldwell and his sons left, Jonah walked through the cabin with Mara. The interior still needed work, walls to be finished, a floor to be properly laid, the sleeping loft to be completed, but the bones were strong. You could see what it would become. The children are going to love having their own space, Mara said, running her hand along one of the smooth wall beams. Thomas especially. He's getting to that age where he needs some privacy, some room to become his own person. He's a good kid, Jonah said. Better than good. He's turning into a fine young man. Thanks to you. Mara turned to face him. He watches you, studies how you handle problems, how you make decisions. He's learning what it means to be a man from watching you work. The observation made Jonah uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite name. I'm just doing what needs doing. No, Mara said firmly. You're doing more than that. You're showing him that being strong doesn't mean being hard, that you can be kind without being weak, that real men take care of people, even when it's difficult. She paused, her voice softening. His father never taught him any of that. He only taught him what not to be. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken understanding hanging between them. Finally, Jonah cleared his throat. We should get the children settled for the night, early start tomorrow. But Mara didn't move. Jonah, I need to say something about what we're building here, about the future. Something in her tone made Jonah's heart beat faster. All right. I know this started as temporary, you helping us until we could get back on our feet, figure out where to go next. But I don't want to go anywhere else. The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for weeks. The children are thriving here. Thomas has purpose. The girls have stability. The little ones are healthy and happy. And she took a breath. I'm happy too. For the first time in longer than I can remember, I wake up not dreading what the day will bring. I wake up wanting to work, wanting to build, wanting to stay. You can stay, Jonah said quietly. I thought that was understood. Is it? Mara challenged. Or are we still in this undefined space where we're guests who've overstayed our welcome, charity cases you can't quite bring yourself to turn out? That's not... I need to know, Jonah. Her eyes held his, unflinching. I need to know if we're building towards something permanent or if this is all temporary and I'm just fooling myself into believing otherwise. Jonah thought about Morton's warnings about the risks and complications of making this arrangement official in any way. But he also thought about how empty the ranch had felt before, how the work had seemed endless and pointless when there was no one to share it with. He thought about Thomas's steady competence, Sarah and Emma's laughter, Luke and Daniel's innocent joy at simple things. He thought about Mara's strength and intelligence, her refusal to be anything less than a full partner in the work of survival. I want you to stay, he said, all of you. Not as guests or charity cases, but as... He struggled for the right word. As family, as partners in making this ranch work. Relief flooded Mara's face, so intense it was almost painful to witness. Partners, she repeated. I like that word. There's practicalities we'll need to work out, Jonah continued, wanting to be clear. Legal things, eventually. Making sure you and the children have protections, have rights to what we build together. I'm not trying to trap you here or make you dependent. I want this to be a real partnership, with everything that means. I understand. Mara's voice was steady now, businesslike. And I agree. We should make things official, proper, for the children's sake if nothing else. They need stability, need to know this is really their home. They shook hands on it, a formal gesture that felt appropriate for the magnitude of what they were agreeing to. But as Jonah's hand clasped Mara's, he felt something shift between them. Not romance exactly, but a deepening of connection, a recognition that their fates were now truly intertwined. The next weeks were a flurry of activity. The cabin's interior took shape rapidly, with Thomas proving particularly skilled at the finish work. He installed the windows with painstaking care, ensuring they'd seal properly against winter winds. The girls helped whitewash the walls, turning the raw wood into bright, clean surfaces. Even Luke and Daniel contributed, smoothing the floorboards with heavy stones wrapped in cloth. Mara's sewing business grew faster than expected. Henderson sold her first 3 dresses within days and ordered 6 more. Women began stopping by the ranch to commission specific pieces, offering measurements and fabric choices. Word spread through the community about the quality of her work, about the careful stitching and thoughtful designs that made each garment special. One woman came from nearly 20 miles away, having heard from her sister about a dress that fit perfectly and lasted through hard use without falling apart. The small room Jonah had originally planned as Mara's sleeping space transformed into a proper workspace, with good light from south-facing windows and a table for cutting patterns. She worked late into the evening sometimes, her needle flashing in lamplight, while the children slept peacefully in the main room. Jonah often found himself watching from his own porch, seeing the glow from her window, and feeling grateful that his lonely ranch had become a place of such industry and purpose. The chicken flock expanded to 20 birds, a mix of laying hens and a rooster Thomas had traded for with another rancher's son. The boy had ridden out on his own, negotiated the deal, and returned with the rooster perched proudly on his saddle. The increased egg production meant they could sell extras in town, bringing in small but steady cash. Jonah built additional coops and runs, and the children took pride in their growing enterprise. Emma had indeed named every hen, and she could tell them apart by slight variations in their feathers that Jonah couldn't distinguish. Sarah kept careful records of which hens laid the most eggs, information that would help them make breeding decisions come spring. Luke and Daniel had developed a morning routine that delighted everyone. The 2 boys would wake at first light, dress quickly, and race to the chicken coop to collect eggs. They'd made it a competition, each claiming responsibility for certain hens, and they'd argue good-naturedly about whose chickens were the better layers. Their laughter echoing across the yard had become Jonah's favorite way to wake up. But not everything went smoothly. In late September, Caleb Morton made his final move. Jonah was in town discussing winter feed prices with the grain merchant when he overheard a conversation between Morton and the land office agent. They stood outside the saloon, not bothering to keep their voices down. "I'm telling you, Reed's in over his head," Morton was saying. "That land's going to fail, and when it does, I want first option to buy." "The Reed place isn't for sale," the agent replied, his tone suggesting this wasn't the first time Morton had made this request. "It will be. Man can't even manage his own ranch. He's got a woman and her brood living there, working him to death. Give it 6 months, maybe a year. He'll default on his taxes, and I'll be ready to take it off his hands." Morton's voice carried that absolute certainty that had always grated on Jonah's nerves. "That land should have been mine years ago. Borders my property, shares my water rights. Reed's father never should have been given that claim in the first place." "Even if that happens," the agent said carefully, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation, "there's no guarantee you'd get first option. There's other ranchers who'd be interested in that land. None with my resources, none who border his property, none who've been patient as long as I have." Morton's voice turned hard, cold with determination. "I've been waiting for Reed to fail since his father died. Thought he'd give up that first winter, sell out and move on. But he's stubborn, I'll give him that. Stubborn and stupid, taking on more responsibility than he can handle over some misplaced sense of charity. When he fails, and he will fail, I'll be there to pick up the pieces." The agent murmured something non-committal and excused himself, clearly wanting to escape the conversation. Morton stood alone for a moment, then noticed Jonah watching from across the street. For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other. Then Morton smiled coldly, tipped his hat in mock courtesy, and walked away with the confident stride of a man who believed time was on his side. Jonah returned to the ranch with Morton's words echoing in his mind. The man wasn't just predicting failure, he was counting on it, maybe even relishing the prospect. The thought was infuriating, but it also clarified something important. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't even just about helping Mara and her children. It was about proving Morton wrong, about showing that kindness wasn't weakness and that helping others didn't have to mean destroying yourself. It was about demonstrating that a different way of living was possible out here, That cooperation could triumph over isolation. He found Mara in her workroom, bent over a partially completed dress, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency through the delicate work of setting sleeves. She looked up as he entered, immediately reading his expression with the perceptiveness she'd developed over the months. "What happened?" she asked, setting down her needle. Jonah told her about the overheard conversation, holding nothing back. As he spoke, Mara's face hardened, her hands stilling on the fabric, her jaw setting in that way that meant she was thinking hard about something. "He's betting on us to fail," she said when Jonah finished. "Seems like it. Has been for months, apparently." "Then we make sure we don't." Mara stood, moving to the window that overlooked the ranch yard where Thomas was working with the horses and the girls were hanging laundry on the line she'd insisted they install. "Jonah, I've been keeping track of our finances. Every penny that comes in, every expense that goes out. I have it all written down in a ledger." She pulled out a small book from her sewing table drawer, its pages covered in neat columns of figures. Jonah hadn't known she was doing this, hadn't asked her to, but the fact that she'd taken the initiative spoke volumes about her commitment to making this work. "The eggs bring in about $3 a week when we sell the surplus," she continued, opening the ledger and showing him her careful records. "My sewing, if I can maintain this current pace, should net between $15 and $20 a month, more during busy seasons like before holidays or weddings. The garden's providing most of our vegetables, which saves us between $10 and $15 monthly in store purchases. I've calculated it carefully." "That's good, but I'm not finished." Mara turned to face him, her expression intense. "Thomas has been talking to other ranchers. The Hendersons need help with their hay harvest next month. The Pritchards want assistance building a new barn before winter. There's work available for a strong young man who knows his way around a ranch. He could hire out for day wages, bring in extra cash. He wants to do it, wants to contribute more." "He already contributes plenty." "He's nearly 13, Jonah. At that age, boys want to prove themselves, want to feel like men. Let him do this. It's good for him." Mara's finger traced down her ledger. "And the little ones, they're old enough now to handle more substantial chores. Luke's been asking if he can help you with the fence repairs, and Daniel wants to learn to curry the horses properly. If they take on more of the routine work, it frees up your time to focus on the most profitable activities, breeding decisions, sale negotiations, that sort of thing." Jonah listened as Mara laid out a financial plan that was both practical and ambitious. She'd clearly been thinking about this for weeks, analyzing their situation with a sharp mind for numbers and logistics that impressed him deeply. She'd thought of details he would never have considered, had solutions for problems he didn't even know they had. "If we're careful," she concluded, her voice carrying conviction, "if we work together and don't waste resources, if we make smart decisions and stay focused, we can not only survive but actually start building capital. Maybe not this year, but certainly by next spring. We could buy breeding stock to improve the herd, expand operations, make the ranch genuinely profitable instead of just barely sustainable." "You've thought this through." "I've thought of little else," Mara admitted, closing the ledger and holding it against her chest like it contained precious secrets. "I know what failure looks like, Jonah. I lived it with my husband for years. Watched him chase dreams he had no plan to achieve, make promises he had no intention of keeping, start things he'd never finish. But I also know what success takes. Hard work, yes, but also smart planning. It takes people willing to support each other instead of tearing each other down. It takes honesty about where you are and realistic assessment of where you want to go. We have all of that here. We actually have a chance." Looking at her determined face, at the ledger she'd clearly been maintaining in secret, at the evidence of her careful planning and preparation, Jonah felt something he'd thought long dead stir in his chest. Hope. Real, substantial hope that maybe, just maybe, they could actually make this work. Not just survive, but thrive. Not just endure, but build something that would last for generations. "All right," he said, making the decision. "Let's do it. Let's prove Morton wrong and build something that lasts. Let's show everyone that there's a different way to live out here." Mara's face broke into a brilliant smile, the kind that transformed her from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "We'll need to be strategic. We'll need to stay disciplined. But yes, we can do this. I know we can." October brought the first frost, delicate and beautiful, transforming the ranch into something from a winter fairy tale for a few precious hours before the sun burned it away. The frost etched intricate patterns on the windows, turned the grass into a field of silver, made everything look clean and new and full of possibility. The children woke to find this transformed world and ran outside in wonder, their breath making clouds in the cold air, their laughter ringing clear in the crisp morning. The garden's production slowed as the weather cooled, but Mara and the girls had already preserved an impressive stockpile. Jars of tomatoes and beans and pickles lined the cellar shelves in neat rows, along with dried herbs hanging from the rafters and bins of stored root vegetables that would last them through the winter. Every time Jonah went down to the cellar, he was struck by the abundance they'd created. This time last year, he'd had a few jars of preserved food and had supplemented mostly with store-bought goods he could barely afford. Now they had enough to weather a hard winter and still have some to spare. The cabin was finished just in time. On a crisp Saturday morning in mid-October, the Hale family moved from the shed to their new home. It wasn't a long journey, just across the yard, a distance that took less than 5 minutes to walk. But the significance was profound. The children made a game of it, carrying their few possessions with elaborate ceremony, as if they were moving into a palace instead of a simple cabin. Thomas carried the family Bible that had belonged to Mara's grandmother, handling it with reverence. Sarah and Emma brought the quilts they'd been working on with their mother, bright patchworks of color made from fabric scraps. Luke proudly bore the wooden horse Jonah had carved for him during a long evening on the porch. Daniel clutched a small box containing the rocks and interesting things he'd collected around the ranch, his personal treasures. Mara was the last to enter, carrying nothing but looking at everything. She stood in the main room, turning slowly to take it all in. The sturdy walls that would keep out the winter cold, the windows that let in light and air, the stove that would cook their meals and warm their home, the real beds instead of pallets on the floor, the table where they could gather for meals and conversation. Tears streamed down her face as she looked around at what had been built for her family. "It's perfect," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Absolutely perfect." Thomas put his arm around his mother's shoulders, standing tall despite his slight frame. "We have a real home now," he said quietly. Finally. That evening, they gathered for a celebration supper in the new cabin. Jonah brought food from his house, and Mara cooked it on the new stove, the smell of baking bread filling the space and making it smell like a home instead of just a structure. They ate together, crowded around the table Thomas had constructed with such care, and for the first time since finding them in that broken wagon, Jonah saw the Hale family completely at peace. "I want to propose something," Jonah said when the meal was finished and they were lingering over coffee, real coffee, a luxury they'd allowed themselves for this special occasion. "A formal arrangement, put down in writing and filed with the land office. Mara and I are partners in this ranch, equal partners. The work we do, the profits we make, the decisions we take, they're shared equally. And if something happens to me, the ranch goes to all of you. No questions, no complications, no relatives showing up to claim what isn't theirs." Mara started to protest, but Jonah held up his hand. "I'm not trying to be morbid. I'm trying to be practical. You need security, legal protection, and I need to know that if the worst happens, you and the children will be taken care of. This needs to be official, needs to be recognized by law." "What about your family?" Thomas asked quietly, his young face serious. "Don't you have relatives who'd have a claim? Uncles or cousins or someone?" "None that I've spoken to in a decade. None that ever cared about this place, or about me." Jonah looked around the table at each face in turn, Thomas's earnest concern, Sarah's wide-eyed attention, Emma's thoughtful expression, Luke and Daniel's sleepy contentment, Mara's careful composure masking deep emotion. "You're my family now. That means something. That means everything." They talked late into the night, hammering out details, discussing futures that felt suddenly possible instead of merely hopeful. They made plans for spring planting, for expanding the chicken operation, for Thomas's work with neighboring ranches, for growing Mara's sewing business. They talked about education for the children, about building a future that would give them opportunities beyond just survival. When Jonah finally walked back to his own house, the moon was high and bright, illuminating the ranch in silver light that made everything look magical. He looked back at the cabin, at the warm glow of lamplight in the windows, at the smoke rising from the chimney, at the evidence of life and family and purpose. Home, he thought. This is what home looks like. Not just shelter, but somewhere people belong to each other. November arrived with surprising gentleness. The hard freeze everyone expected held off, granting them extra time to finish preparations for winter. Thomas hired out to 3 different neighboring ranches, coming home exhausted each evening, but with coins in his pocket that he proudly added to the family fund Mara kept in a small tin box. The boy grew stronger with the work, his shoulders broadening, his hands developing calluses, his confidence building with each successful job. Mara's sewing business continued to grow beyond their expectations. She'd started training Sarah in basic stitching, preparing to eventually expand the operation. The girl had a natural talent for it, her small fingers nimble and precise. Emma, while less interested in sewing itself, showed an aptitude for design, suggesting combinations of fabrics and styles that Mara would never have considered, but that proved popular with customers. It was during the second week of November, as the first real cold snap settled over the territory, that Caleb Morton rode up for what would be his final visit. But this time, his demeanor was different, less aggressive, more resigned. He sat on his horse for a long moment before dismounting, as if gathering courage for something difficult. "Reed," he said. "Got a minute?" "What do you want, Morton?" Jonah's voice was wary. He'd learned not to trust the man's shifts in mood. The big man looked around the ranch, taking in the improvements with what might have been grudging respect. The new cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, the expanded chicken coops, the well-maintained barn, the organized yard. His gaze lingered on Thomas and Luke working together to stack firewood, on the girls hanging laundry despite the cold, on the general air of purposeful activity. "Looks like you've managed to make this work after all," Morton said finally. "We have. I heard about your arrangement with the woman, the partnership." Morton shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Heard you're planning to make it legal, put it in writing with the land office. News travels fast. Small community. People talk." Morton was quiet for a moment, then sighed, a sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "I came to apologize." Jonah stared at him, genuinely shocked into silence. "You what?" "I was wrong. About you, about them, about what would happen here." Morton's voice was rough, the words clearly difficult for a proud man to say. "I've been ranching 30 years, Reed. Seen a lot of people try and fail. Seen families broken by this land, seen dreams crushed by drought and debt and bad luck. Got bitter about it, I guess. Started assuming everyone would fail. Started maybe even wanting them to, so I could feel justified in my own choices, in my own loneliness." "Morton, let me finish. I need to say this." The older man held up his hand and Jonah saw it was shaking slightly. "I watched you nearly die trying to save that boy. Watched you work yourself to the bone building that cabin. Watched those children transform from scared, half-starved things into capable young people. Watched that woman turn a failed garden into something productive. And I realized something. You're not failing. You're succeeding in ways I never did, in ways I never even tried." "I don't understand." "I built a profitable ranch," Morton said slowly, choosing his words with care. "Biggest spread in 3 counties. Got more cattle, more land, more money than most men around here will see in a lifetime. But I built it alone. Drove away anyone who tried to get close because I thought needing people was weakness. Thought asking for help was admitting defeat. Thought that self-sufficiency was the only virtue that mattered." He paused, his weathered face showing emotions Jonah had never seen there before. "Now I'm 60 years old, sitting in a big house with no one to share it with, no one to leave it to, no one who'll miss me when I'm gone. I'll die alone, Reed, and everything I built will go to distant relatives who never cared about me or this land. That's my legacy." Jonah didn't know what to say. Morton had been his antagonist for months, the voice warning him he was making terrible mistakes, the presence suggesting that kindness was foolishness. To have that voice now admit it had been wrong felt surreal, felt like the world had shifted on its axis. "You've got something I'll never have," Morton continued, his voice thick with regret. "You've got family, real family, the kind you choose, the kind that's built on more than just blood or obligation. You've got children who respect you because you've earned it, not because they have to. You've got a partner who works alongside you instead of demanding you handle everything alone. That's worth more than all the cattle in Colorado. That's worth everything. I appreciate that, Jonah said finally, finding his voice. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry you're alone. That can't be easy. It's my own fault. Made my choices. Have to live with them. Morton remounted his horse, moving with the stiffness of age and regret. But you, Reed, you made different choices. Better ones. I wanted you to know I see that now. I wanted you to know that I was wrong to try to discourage you, wrong to predict your failure. You're building something real here, something that'll outlast both of us. He rode away, and this time when Jonah watched him go, it was without anger or resentment. Just a kind of sadness for a man who'd let bitterness and fear isolate him from the very connections that made life bearable. A cautionary tale of what Jonah himself might have become if he'd ridden past that broken wagon, if he'd chosen safety over compassion. Mara emerged from the cabin, having witnessed the exchange from the window. What was that about? She asked, coming to stand beside him. Redemption, Jonah said. I think, or maybe just regret. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. She slipped her hand into his, a gesture that had become natural between them over the months. Not romantic. They'd been careful to maintain appropriate boundaries, mindful of propriety and the children's perceptions, but companionable. Partnership expressed through simple touch. The children want to know if we can have a proper celebration for finishing the cabin, Mara said. Maybe invite some of the neighbors, the Caldwells, Henderson from the store and his wife. Show people what we've built together. I think that's a fine idea, a very fine idea indeed. The celebration happened on a Saturday in late November, just as the first real snow began to fall in fat, lazy flakes that promised a gentle storm rather than a blizzard. The Caldwells came with their sons and their wives, bringing laughter and noise and good cheer. Henderson arrived with his wife and their teenage daughter, contributing fresh bread and preserves that his wife had made. And to everyone's surprise, even the land office agent and his family appeared, bringing dried apples and honey and warm congratulations. The cabin filled with voices and laughter, children running between adults, food appearing from seemingly nowhere as each family contributed dishes. Roasted meat and fresh bread, preserved vegetables and dried fruit, pies and cakes that represented hours of work. Someone brought a fiddle, and soon there was music filling the small space, spilling out into the snowy afternoon. Thomas showed the Caldwell boys the improvements they'd made to the barn, explaining with pride the work they'd done to reinforce the structure and expand the stalls. Sarah and Emma performed a song they'd been practicing in secret, their young voices surprisingly harmonious as they sang about home and family. Luke and Daniel demonstrated how well they could feed the chickens now, their small faces serious with concentration as they explained the routine they'd developed. And Jonah stood with Mara, watching it all, feeling overwhelmed by the sheer improbability of this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been alone, struggling, wondering if he had the strength to face another winter. The ranch had felt like a burden, a responsibility he carried more from stubbornness than any real hope. Now his home was full of people and purpose, full of life and possibility, full of evidence that something real and lasting could be built even in this hard country. Thank you, Mara said quietly, her voice meant only for him beneath the music and conversation. For everything. For taking us in when you had no reason to, for giving us a chance when most men would have ridden past, for helping us build this life. Thank you, Jonah countered, for seeing potential in this place when I'd almost given up on it, for bringing your children and your strength and your refusal to quit, for showing me that I didn't have to be alone, that asking for help wasn't weakness. You saved this ranch as much as I saved you, maybe more. Then we saved each other, Mara said, and smiled, a real smile, full of genuine happiness. That's how it's supposed to work, isn't it? People helping people, everyone contributing what they can. As the party wound down and guests began departing into the gathering snow, Henderson pulled Jonah aside near the door. I wanted you to know there's talk in town about what you've done here. Good talk. People are impressed by how you've turned things around, how you've made this partnership work. It wasn't just me, it was all of us working together. I know that. That's what makes it impressive. Henderson glanced at where Mara was helping clean up, at the children working together to restore order to their new home. You built something real here, Reed. Something that'll last. Not just a ranch, but a family. That's rare out here, where most people are too busy fighting the land and each other to build anything meaningful. You're showing people a different way. After everyone had gone and the children were in bed in the loft, their soft breathing filling the cabin with peaceful sounds, Jonah and Mara stood outside watching the snowfall. It came down in thick, soft flakes, covering the ranch in pristine white, transforming the familiar landscape into something new and clean and full of promise. "Winter's really here," Mara observed, pulling her shawl tighter against the cold. "We're ready for it," Jonah said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. The cellar was stocked with preserved food, the animals were sheltered and well fed. Both cabins were tight against the cold with good stoves and plenty of firewood. They'd worked hard through the summer and fall, and now they could face winter not with dread, but with confidence, not with fear, but with anticipation. "I was thinking," Mara said, her breath making clouds in the cold air. "Come spring, we should plant an orchard. Apple trees, maybe some pear if we can find good stock. It'll take years before they produce anything substantial, but it's an investment in the future. Something that'll still be here when the children are grown." I like that idea very much. And Thomas wants to learn about cattle breeding properly. He's been reading everything he can find, asking questions of every rancher he works for. I think he's serious about making this his life, about taking over the ranch eventually. Jonah thought about the boy who'd arrived months ago, thin and scared and uncertain, trying so hard to be invisible. That boy had transformed into a capable young man with plans and ambitions, someone building toward a future instead of just surviving the present. The change was remarkable, and Jonah felt privileged to have witnessed it, to have been part of it. "He'll make a fine rancher," Jonah said. "Better than I ever was, probably. He's got the right instincts for it." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the snow accumulate on the fence posts and barn roof, on the newly completed cabin and the organized yard. In the cabin behind them, someone, probably Sarah, started singing softly, a lullaby for the younger children, her voice sweet and clear in the quiet night. The sound drifted through the cold air, beautiful and heartbreaking and full of hope. "You know what I realized?" Mara said eventually, her voice thoughtful. "The day you found us, when I was sitting in that broken wagon, absolutely certain we were all going to die, I couldn't imagine any future beyond the next few hours. Couldn't see past the heat and the thirst and the fear that I'd failed my children, that I'd led them to their deaths following a man who'd abandoned us. But now—" She gestured at the ranch, at the cabin, at the life they'd built together. "Now I can see years ahead. I can see Thomas running this ranch with a family of his own. I can see the girls grown and capable and confident. I can see Luke and Daniel becoming men who know what real work means, who understand that family isn't just blood, but choice. I can see a real future, and it's here. It's all here." "It's here," Jonah agreed, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones. "And it's ours. All of ours." The snow fell harder, thick flakes that would accumulate through the night, and they finally retreated to their respective homes. Jonah built up his fire and sat in front of it, warming his hands and his heart, thinking about the impossible summer that had somehow become permanent, about dust turned into home, about strangers become family, about the way kindness could multiply when given freely, about how the hardest choice had turned out to be the best one. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the house with that particular sound winter made in the Colorado territory. But inside it was warm and safe. And across the yard, in the cabin he'd built with his own hands and his own determination, 6 people slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they belonged here, that this was truly home, that they'd never have to wonder where the next meal would come from, or where they'd sleep, or whether anyone cared if they lived or died. Jonah Reed was no longer alone. And in the morning, there would be work to do, challenges to face, a future to build together. But tonight, with snow falling thick and fast and the fire crackling warm, there was only contentment, only the deep satisfaction of knowing that something good had been built from nothing, that lives had been changed, including his own, that hope had triumphed over despair. He'd taken a chance on a broken wagon and a desperate family. That chance had transformed everything: the ranch, his life, his understanding of what it meant to be strong and what it meant to be alone. He'd learned that real strength came from connection, not isolation. That the heaviest burdens became lighter when shared. That sometimes the best thing a man could do was open his door and his heart to people who needed both. The summer had been brutal and beautiful, full of heat and hardship and unexpected grace. But they'd survived it together, turned its challenges into opportunities, its desperation into determination. And now winter had come, and they were ready. More than ready, they were prepared, organized, working together toward a future that felt increasingly possible with each passing day. Outside, Caleb Morton rode past the Reed Ranch one final time, looking at the lights glowing in two sets of windows, at the smoke rising from two chimneys instead of one, at the evidence of life and family and hope flourishing where he'd predicted only failure. He didn't stop. There was nothing left to say, no warnings left to give, no advice that would change anything. Reed had made his choice and made it work, had proved every prediction wrong, had shown that there was indeed a different way to live out here. Morton continued home to his empty house, while behind him, the Reed Ranch settled into its first winter as something more than just land and labor. It had become a home in the truest sense, not because of the buildings or the boundaries, but because of the people who'd chosen to build their lives there together, who'd decided that this place was worth fighting for, worth working for, worth transforming from dust into something permanent. And when spring came, as it always did, they would plant that orchard Mara had mentioned. They would expand the garden and the chicken operation. They would continue building, continue growing, continue proving that dust and desperation could indeed transform into something solid and lasting. They would show everyone who doubted that partnership was stronger than isolation, that kindness was more powerful than cynicism, that family, however it was formed, was the foundation upon which everything else was built. But that was the future, bright and full of possibility. Tonight there was only this moment, this perfect stillness, this peace earned through summer heat and shared struggle, and the refusal to give up even when giving up would have been easier. Tonight there was family and warmth, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing they'd turned an ending into a beginning, turned loss into gain, turned loneliness into belonging. The snow continued to fall, covering everything in white possibility, erasing the harsh lines and covering the scars, making the world new again. And in the cabin behind the barn, Sarah's lullaby faded into comfortable silence as sleep claimed them all. 6 people who'd almost died in the desert heat, now safe and warm and home, their future secured not by luck or charity, but by the decision one man had made to stop when he could have ridden past, to help when he could have turned away, to believe that some things were worth the risk even when the risk seemed impossibly high. Jonah Reed closed his eyes and smiled, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Not just contentment or satisfaction, but genuine happiness, the kind that came from knowing you'd done the right thing, had made the hard choice, had let people into your life even when it would have been safer to stay alone. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own work, its own small victories and setbacks. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the loneliness that had defined his existence was completely, thoroughly, permanently gone. And that made everything, every sacrifice, every risk, every difficult choice, every moment of doubt worthwhile. The summer that had threatened to destroy them all had instead forged them into something stronger, something that would endure through winters and years, through hardships yet to come and joys not yet imagined. They hadn't just survived the summer's brutal heat. They'd turned it into fuel for building something permanent, something real, something that would last. They'd turned dust into home, and that home would stand against winter storms and summer droughts, against doubters like Morton and the inevitable hardships that lay ahead, against anything the territory could throw at them, because it was built on more than just wood and stone. It was built on choice and commitment, on shared work and shared dreams, on the revolutionary idea that people didn't have to face this hard world alone. The fire burned low in the hearth. Outside, the snow fell silent and steady, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its lonely call to the winter moon. But inside the Reed Ranch, in both the main house and the new cabin, there was only warmth and peace and the breathing of people who belonged to each other, who'd chosen each other, who'd built something worth having from nothing but determination and hope. The story that had begun with heat and desperation had ended with snow and belonging. And that, Jonah thought as sleep finally claimed him, was exactly how it should be.